afternoon, and welcome to Guilford Courthouse National Military Park's commemoration of the 240th anniversary of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. Today, we are going to be featuring author John Knight, who wrote War at Saber Point, Banastre Tarleton, and the British Legion.
John Knight earned a joint honors degree in American history and politics from Warwick University. He was a fine art appraiser specializing in Victorian paintings for several London-based auction houses, including Christie's, before taking up writing and lecturing full-time. A regular contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution, his published pieces have included new research on the execution of John Andre and Benedict Arnold's British Army career. He splits his time between homes in Nottingham, England, and Dutchess County, New York. He is currently working on his follow-up work to War at Saber Point, which will focus on American prisoners of war. His book, War at Saber Point, was published by Westholme Publishing and released in December of 2020. Today, we're speaking with author John Knight, who wrote War at Saber Point. Now, would you mind going in depth a little bit about how you discovered the topic of your book, and really what is the book about?
Well, I've always been slightly a contrarian as a writer. I'm more interested in people who have been displayed as villains than those who have had marble statues produced about them. So originally I intended doing a book on Benedict Arnold, who of course is the other major villain of the American Revolution. But the more I went into it, the more I realized that actually, although Benedict Arnold had started out as a one-dimensional villain, over the last 15, 20 years, there's been a massive reassessment of Benedict Arnold, and it would be almost impossible, I think, to produce a book and say something fresh. There's probably been more books been written about Benedict Arnold than anybody other than Washington himself. So the danger was that you take a contrarian view just in order to be fresh, and I didn't want to do that. And it occurred to me that the one other major villain of the revolution, practically nothing has been written about him. To say that Banastre Tarleton is so reviled in America and is completely forgotten in the United Kingdom, just one book, 70 years old. And I thought, well, this gives me a fresh opportunity to look at somebody and actually examine whether or not that reputation was deserved. And as I went into the book, I became more fascinated actually by the men who followed him, because they actually became a book in themselves. And probably even more than Tarleton, I thought that needed a reassessment. So these men who followed Banastre Tarleton in the British Legion were not the people I expected them to be when I first started researching it. Again, there's a myth that's been portrayed about loyalists in the American Revolution, and that is that they were normally extremely wealthy. Normally they had a vested interest. They didn't want the British Empire and connections to fall away because they had pocketbook interests. In fact, I found that most of the men who fought in the other ranks, certainly not the officers, were just commonplace Americans that actually mirrored those who fought for the patriot cause. An awful lot of them were farmers. Some of them were small landowners, shoemakers, millers, just the commonplace occupations that dominated American life. And they fought on principle. They didn't fight because they thought they were going to get something out of it. And not only did they fight on principle, they lasted throughout the entire war, which I think was, commendable in one way. At the end of the war, the patriotism for the United Kingdom cause or the Crown forces was so great that they were prepared to up and start an entirely new colony in Nova Scotia.
So if you were to tell someone to start initial research on this topic, what is something that you think is important to consider when studying the British Legion or Tarleton? How has the historiography of these topics influenced how people learn about them?
I think there's a one-dimensional aspect to Tarleton and the British Legion, and that is that they were bad or sociopathic. Bad in the sense that they were loyalists who were traitors. In fact, these men didn't regard themselves as traitors. They regarded the people who were opposing the Crown forces as traitors. Tarleton himself was far from being anything other than a very complicated and contrary figure. And the more you study about him, the more you realize that this was a man who was also in an awful lot of pain. Not a lot has been talked about him as a human being. A lot has been talked about him as a soldier, but not a lot has been spoken about him as a human being, and I wanted to bring that out. So I wanted to bring out stories that actually showed the man as well as the soldier.
And what did you find? What can you tell us about Tarleton as a person?
Well, I think, virtue is admirable, but vice is more interesting. I mean, what you need to remember about Tarleton, I think, is that he was an addict. That's the most important thing about him. His addictions of choice were women and gambling, but like all addicts, he was essentially a young man in a lot of pain, out of control. And I'll read one quote from the book, if I may.
Absolutely.
This sums up Tarleton for me. And he wrote this to his mother while he was in Philadelphia. And he writes to her, but my infatuation yet rambles in my heart. My cursed itch for play, meaning gambling, as unless you extend your benevolent hand, totally blasted my bright expectations. So this is a young man who's only 23, 24. And that phrase, my infatuation yet rambles in my heart, I think is a very poetic way of expressing a young man who's out of control. And if you study Tarleton's career, he was always after the next big adrenaline rush. The way he fought his battles was as a gambler. He constantly went into the attack, and he often fought opposing forces that were 5, 6 to 1 against. Now, no sensible cavalry officer would have done that. Tarleton did it almost as default. And you get the feeling that this is a man who's looking for that adrenaline.
Tarleton is recognized for his military successes. However, a lot of those military successes come with a very deeply negative connotation. Yeah. And you hear monikers like Bloody Tarleton or phrases like Tarleton's Quarter. What are your thoughts on those?
Well, I think the way that Tarleton is still portrayed in America now revolves around two real things. One is The Patriot, the film. Mm-hmm. That film, actually, I love that film, although as a piece of history, I think it's absolute, you need to have your tongue very firmly in your cheek. I mean, it is nonsense as history, but as a film, it brings a lot of people to the American Revolution. And Jason Isaacs, who ironically was also born in Liverpool like Tarleton, plays an admirable villain. I mean, he's one of the great villains in cinematic history. But that one-dimensional psychopathic killer is not what Tarleton was, but what a lot of people think he is. Now, the other thing that you mentioned there, which is interesting, is this nickname of Bloody Ban. Now, I once had a massive argument with an American historian who was not a Tarleton fan, who kept referring to Bloody Ban, and I offered him $50 if he could show me any contemporary evidence that anybody ever called him Bloody Ban, and I'm still waiting to pay up. Now, my theory is that nickname was made up by Robert Bass in the 1950s, and it's such a great name, it stuck. But no contemporary referred to him as that, although is evidence that he was referred to as Bloody Tarleton. But that Bloody Ban image is what's gone through the centuries, and it's such a great nickname. It's such a one-dimensional way to approach a villain that nobody's really taken the effort, I think, to look at the other side of it, which is what I wanted to do.
Absolutely. And that's something that's come up in a few other books, just to clarify for viewers. So Brutal Virtue and The Green Dragoon, that was published in the 1950s, is Robert Bass's book that first introduces Bloody Ban, which is why it's such an interesting idea to discuss, since it's so closely tied to Tarleton's current image. Even still, you'll see museum panels who label that as Tarleton's moniker, even though no contemporaries seem to have called him by that.
No. And I mean, the Robert Bass book is interesting because I do like the Robert Bass book. And it's very admirable in a way that it's the first real scholastic study of Tarleton. And it continues, unlike my book, after the war. In fact, I think the weakness of Robert Bass's book is that the war years are not particularly well covered. And you get the impression he wants to rush as quickly as he can to the Regency area and the relationship he had with Mary Robinson. That seems to be far more interesting to him. But interestingly, he quotes certain sources which I couldn't find. Now, whether those papers have been lost or not, because he did have access to family papers. And a lot of the times I looked at certain stories he'd come up with and I could find no evidence for them. I'm not saying he was making it up. It was frustrating that I couldn't find that myself. So I think that the Robert Bass book is great. It's a bit dated in its language now. And I think it doesn't do Tarleton a great justice, but I think if you want to read another book, that would be the one I'd pick.
Can you tell us more about the role of the British Legion in the South and what made them so special?
Well, if you were to ask me one reason, one tactical reason why the British lost the war, there were plenty of strategic reasons why they lost the war. But one tactical reason they lost the war is they didn't have enough cavalry. I mean, they had just two cavalry regiments shipped over from the United Kingdom, the 16th and 17th Dragoons. One of those went back. So for most of the war, they were fighting with just the 17th Dragoons, which meant that they had to recruit loyalist regiments, loyalist cavalry regiments. And for a Britain, the sheer size of the United States as it is now and the 13 colonies as it was then is astonishing. I don't think they realized how big it was and how much they needed mobility. Because of that, the British Army fell back almost entirely on two loyalist regiments, the Queen's Hussars and the British Legion. Without those two regiments, I think the war wouldn't have lasted anything like as long as it did. And the British Legion took part in practically every battle in the Southern Theatre.
So one of the battles, of course, that is most associated with the British Legion would be the Battle of Waxhaws, which is also commonly referred to as Buford's Massacre, even still in the United States. So can I ask your thoughts on that historical episode? It has quite the reputation.
Yeah, I think if any one battle cemented Tarleton's reputation as a sociopathic killer, it is the Waxhaws Massacre. It occurred basically on May the 29th, 1780, just after the British had taken Charleston at the second attempt. It was one of the biggest British victories of the war. And suddenly the American cause, not just in South Carolina, but in the South, seems finished. Now, there's one force of reserves that was heading down from Virginia to try and get to Charleston, but on learning that the city has surrendered, decides wisely to turn back. Now, Henry Clinton, who was in charge of the British forces, thinks, well, there's still a threat to my line of communications. I can't send ordinary infantry troops there. They'll never catch them in time. And so he sends Tarleton's British Legion. And in an incredibly forced march, which became Tarleton's almost the way that he expressed himself, he gets his men to catch up with Buford, which in itself is a massive achievement, and draws Buford into a battle. Now, Buford makes a massive mistake in that he lines his men up in a single line and orders them not to fire at the dragoons until they're almost on top of them, which is a massive mistake. They only get one volley off. No sooner do they get the one volley off than Tarleton's dragoons are in amongst them. Major Cochrane, who led the infantry element of the British Legion, follows up with the bayonet, and the battle only lasts literally minutes before the Americans start to surrender. Now, the controversy comes from what happened after that. Now, the American line has always been that the Americans tried to surrender. They sent a white flag bearer. Tarleton killed that white flag bearer in some of the stories that you get, and then they start to massacre the American forces. Now, my own research, insofar as it went, was that I absolutely agree that there was a massacre. After all, there were 113 men killed and 147 wounded in that battle, which doesn't sound a lot compared to, say, a Civil War battle, but trust me, that's a very big ratio of men killed and wounded compared to who were fought. But that's almost a third of Buford's entire force who were killed or wounded, which is way over what you would normally expect. But Tarleton himself wasn't responsible, I'm certain of that. His horse was shot from under him for a start. He was probably unconscious, or certainly he was forced to combat during the massacre. So he wasn't directly responsible for it, but I do believe there was a massacre that took place. However, you could argue that Buford himself was just as responsible for that through his inept command of the American forces as was Tarleton.
So, speaking of Tarleton receiving injuries, at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, he receives a wound that causes him to lose fingers on his hand. Just out of curiosity, does he write further about how that impacts his life, or does it come up much in primary sources?
It does, but there's actually some confusion about which fingers he actually lost. So he suffers two separate wounds on during the Battle of Guilford and just prior to the Battle of Guilford. And the British Legion surgeon amputates two of his fingers. Now, to give Tarleton his due, that should have been the end of anybody else's career. Anybody else would have thought, well, I've done my duty to king and country. I deserve it, to go back home. Not only does he not let it disable him in terms of being a cavalry commander, he learns to fight with his left hand and write with his left hand. He loses 2 fingers on his right hand. Now, there is some debate about which 2 fingers he lost. Some people say he lost the thumb and the forefinger. I believe he lost the index finger and the forefinger. He does speak about it, but he speaks about it almost in a jolly way, which I think is one of the good things about him. He didn't have a maudlin personality. And you can imagine if that happened to anybody else, you'd be, naturally depressed and despondent. Within a few days, he's writing light-hearted letters to his sister, Bridget. After the war, he plays up on his injury, and during his run for Parliament, he turns it actually into an asset, and he stands on the hustings and holds his hand up and said, here is Colonel Tarleton, you know him, he never ran from an American saber or ran after a ministerial purse. And it's a kind of Churchillian gesture way ahead of Churchill. I think it's a great little tick that Tarleton adopted later on in life. So in some way it was to his advantage.
So in your book, War at Saber Point, what would you like readers to take away from what you've found? What do you think it brings to the historiography of Tarleton and the British Legion?
Well, somebody much cleverer than me, and forgive me, I can't remember who it was, said that the universe is made up of stories, not atoms. And by that, I took it to mean that they meant that there's only so far that facts can get you. So I've read plenty of books that are desiccated facts. On this day, the British Legion camped here. On the next day, they fought here. I'm more interested in the personalities that made up that regiment. So I tried to bring to light some of the people who actually fought for the British Legion, particularly the Americans, what happened to them before and after the war, what motivated them. Because there wasn't anything. I could find nothing. And primary sources, I'm afraid, are very thin on the ground. So some of it, you've got to kind of read between the lines. But if anybody takes anything from the book, I hope it's that I bring to life a section of the American population that's largely being ignored. So the book is as much about those men who fought for Tarleton as it is about Tarleton himself.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you'd really like to bring up and review for this author talk? Any topics in particular that really intrigued you while you were writing your book, that surprised you?
I think when I started the book, I had no set agenda. I don't think, naturally being British, I probably had a more sympathetic approach to Tarleton than an American would have done. But I wasn't out to crusade on his behalf. I was surprised by how much I ended up liking him as a man. I mean, and that seems strange because he struck me, and I think I used the phrase in the book that the one thing about Tarleton was he liked what all young men liked. And he was sought out. He was the kind of guy who, in a crowd, everybody thinks is good fun. Now, occasionally that can become tiresome, and there's no doubt whatsoever that he was vain, that he was egotistical. But I also think that he was the kind of person who the British Army needed. Young men like Tarleton. If there's any criticism about the way the British fought the war, they were slightly dilatory. Tarleton wasn't. The one thing about Tarleton was he was all action, and it's an interesting what if that had the British been officered at a senior level by people like Tarleton or Rowden or Ferguson, I think they probably would have won that war. As it was, fortunately for you, they weren't. They were only junior officers.
And then I guess another question would be, how would you describe Tarleton's relationship with Cornwallis? Because later in life, they do have a falling out.
Big time. And it's a fascinating relationship, actually, because at the beginning, it's almost like father-son, although Cornwallis is not that much older than Tarleton. He's not, I suppose you could argue he's just about old enough to be his father, but they are very, very much a father-son relationship. And the respect that Cornwallis shows to Tarleton is absolutely amazing. Time after time, when you read Cornwallis's dispatches, he praises Tarleton way above the way he praises his other infantry commanders like Colonel Webster. And I always think that in a way, Tarleton is another side of Cornwallis's personality, the kind of person that Cornwallis wanted to be without the fetters on. Later on, as you say, in typical fashion, Tarleton writes a book at the end of the war, some 4 or 5 years after the war, and essentially blames Cornwallis, I think unfairly, for Tarleton's loss and defeat at Cowpens, and also Ferguson's annihilation at King's Mountain. Very unfair in my view. I think there's some elements of Tarleton's criticism and critique which is correct, but he didn't really have to write that, and they have a massive falling out. Funnily enough, Cornwallis, being the aristocratic gentleman he is, never actually directly addresses it. So you'll never see Cornwallis directly say, I think this is wrong, or challenging Tarleton to a duel. But a lot of the officers who were under both Cornwallis and Tarleton turn on Tarleton, and in some way that destroys his reputation in Britain. He never really recovers from that, I don't think.
I know that Charles Steadman, the commissary officer with Cornwallis, absolutely hates Tarleton throughout his papers, accuses him of being sort of nothing more than hot air in a way, describes him as very arrogant without the skill. It's a very accusatory tone he takes.
Yeah. I mean, and that again becomes the default assessment of Tarleton's ability. Harry Lee also takes on a similar tone by portraying Tarleton as a rake-out commander. In other words, I think he actually says that Tarleton's tactics are to get there first, attack, and then that's it. A one-dimensional cavalry officer. That's really unfair, to be honest. It is true that a pivotal part of Tarleton's ability is to get there fast, but the idea that he just attacked and that's all he did, I think is nonsense. He actually was a very sophisticated tactician, and some battles he was extremely impressive. Of course, the one where he comes a complete cropper at Cowpens is probably his worst fought battle, and that criticism there is justified. Tarleton doesn't do the recce, he doesn't listen to his junior officers, and he comes unstuck because of it.
You brought up Light Horse Harry Lee. He is often compared to Tarleton since they held very similar roles. How do you think the dichotomy between those two men shows more about either of them? Do you think it's fair to compare them? In what ways are they similar and different?
I think there is a definite similarity between the two of them, and they were both aggressive cavalry commanders, which you have to be as a cavalry commander. Cavalry is not a defensive art form. If all you're going to do is forage and shield an army, you're pretty useless. The best cavalry officers are those who want to attack, and both of them had a very aggressive attitude. And I think both of them were actually very similar personalities, to be honest. I mean, I'm not suggesting for 1 second that Harry Lee had the personal issues that Tarleton had, but I think they were similar, very similar men. But history have treated them, to say that they were similar men, history has treated them in very different ways.
I think it's just interesting to note too, Light Horse Harry Lee had his own addictions. He was addicted to land speculation. And I think it's just so fascinating to compare these individuals because they encountered each other. They were directly opposed. And yet so much in their lives, I think, can be accurately compared and fairly compared.
The one thing that keeps him alive, I think, more than anything, and this is an interesting point is, you'll know obviously the iconic full-length portrait of him by Sir Joshua Reynolds, which is one of the most beautiful portraits that was painted in the 18th century. The fascinating thing is that sits in the rotunda in the National Gallery in London, and when people go in there, there are pictures from the 14th century Italian right the way up to modern British paintings and post-impressionists. At the end, in the shop where you can buy the postcards of which picture you like the most, that's the most bought image, even from people who don't know anything about him. So just, it's such a striking image, and I think that probably is the one thing that keeps his memory alive, actually. When you see it in real life, actually, it's even better. You can see him, he's still a young man there. He's only, I think, 27, 28 when the portrait was painted.
All right. Well, I think that wraps most everything up. Thank you so much for talking with us and for taking the time to share what you've shared about Tarleton and the British Legion. It's been very informative.
Kate, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for that.
We hope you've enjoyed this video featuring author John Knight, who wrote War at Saber Point, Banastre Tarleton, and the British Legion. Stay tuned for more content commemorating the 240th anniversary of the Battle of Guilford Courthouse.